to Cassette Connection, the podcast where we discuss music and meaning with the people who make it. My name is Ben, and with me is Alex.
This episode, we talk to musician Benjamin Drury. Ben is a composer and producer who also plays bass in the band Helena Pop. Ben is a seasoned performer and composer who has composed works for multiple festivals, including the Canberra International Music Festival and You Are Here.
We talk about Ben's body of work and some of the different approaches to composition that Ben has taken. Ben tells us about creating music for different settings and the process of discovering the nuances between musician, space, and audience. Ben also gives us a very in-depth look into the world of machine learning and music creation. We also talk about installation work and site-specific works, delivering a new experience to audiences away from regular venues. And we also touch briefly on Ben's experience playing in bands.
Listen.
I'm Benjamin Drury. I'm a musician formerly from Canberra, now living in Melbourne. I do composition stuff and music production stuff, and I play bass in the band Helena Pop. I guess my musical life started. I was birthed into music at. I just sort of had a guitar around that my parents got for me. I think as like a primary schooler, I was like, "Hey, that'd be sick. I'm gonna learn guitar," and then played it for like a minute, and then went back to playing video games. But then as like an early teenager, I picked it up again, I guess. I was just really into Green Day, you know, like, so yeah, I started playing guitar on this like little nylon guy and got really into it. Eventually, like, I applied to join the school band playing bass because that meant that I could borrow a bass for free from the school and I would just have a bass around, which would be pretty sick. So I did that. I somehow became really into playing bass, like way more into it than anyone reasonably should be. I think like at the place where I did music lessons, I saw like a little flyer that was for like they wanted people to audition to be the bass player in their band, and that was the first band I ever joined. We played, I guess, a bunch of gigs at like youth centers and stuff. From there, I guess I started to get into like jazz, doing that with my teacher. And I did ANU's like pre-tertiary jazz program. And I guess at around this same time, I joined another band called Sweeto, who were what you would call successful, I guess, to a degree. Like we were in, to use like, I guess, conventional markers of success, we were in Girlfriend magazine at a point, across the page from 5 Seconds of Summer. We were like signed with a manager. That band eventually broke up. Jordan's still going. If you want to check out Jordan Sweeto for some video content, some songs. And I think there are still a couple of those songs that I played bass on the internet, if you feel like digging it up. then I guess I took a year off school after I graduated, worked in a cafe. This isn't that important. But I guess actually at around this time was when I first saw bands like Deerhoof played a show in Canberra. And there were these bands like TV Colors, I think, was supporting. So they're like a Canberra band who does stuff with like a laptop on stage, but while playing guitars. And at around this time, like I just had Cubase 4 LE, so limited version of Cubase on my computer, and I was messing around with like recording stuff and sequencing stuff and putting effects on things. I guess I just had a lot of curiosity about sound at this point in my life. And I was very into like doing things, and I like would just make weird pieces of music and never show them to anyone because I just assumed that no one could possibly be interested in like my Bit Crusher experiments, which was probably a fair decision. But yeah, I think that after that, I kind of started following some people like Ruben Ingall, just around, going to shows where they were, and like just finding all this really like kind of no wave, like really beautiful, just strange music that was really exciting. I found like Sia's label, Hello Square, which was also really cool. I remember being in a workshop, probably, yeah, so with 4 people at the ANU, and it was Joe Talia, who does like Revox tape machine music. He's also a drummer. But he does this stuff where like he'll have tape loops and like kind of move them around and make all these weird sounds, and they're really great. But yeah, I remember being in a workshop with like Sia, Charles Martin, and this guy Joe Talia, and like no one knew who I was. I was just this like 19-year-old kid who wasn't like at the School of Music or anything, and people were just like, how did you, what are you doing here? And then, yeah, I think at this time I was still quite invested in playing the bass as well. Like those kind of things were very like, they were there, like becoming very interesting to me, but I was also like still getting like double bass lessons and like learning jazz standards and stuff. So I auditioned to the School of Music at ANU to become a performance student, playing double bass, and then I went to the ANU to do that, and that's kind of where everything like started in earnest. So like I just gave you quite a lot of preamble. But yeah, here we are. So I guess one of the formative like experiences at ANU was going to a concert by Alec Hunter. So Alec was really new to the school at that time. And I think he had just been given like an ensemble of like, here are some people who like playing music, and they just kind of improvised for like an hour, and it was amazing. And it was just really like quite mind-blowing to see all this stuff that was like, I thought of as very strange and esoteric, and no one was very interested in it, like kind of put forth in a way that was like very, I guess, very beautiful and I guess eye-opening as well. Like it was very, like there were clearly elements of like jazz and classical music and like noise and like even a bit of pop music, and it all just kind of fit through the kind of internal logic of the ensemble. Like it felt like there was this kind of rulelessness to it, which I was very like attracted to. And I guess at this point, I just kind of started going to Alec's office and being like, "Hey, do you want to like teach me stuff?" Which thankfully Alec did. And I am forever grateful. But I guess at this point, I was kind of introduced to the idea that a composer could be like a regular person, or like there wasn't necessarily a difference like between a person who composes music and a composer. The thing that I value most in music is like curiosity and inquisitiveness, like finding things that are really interesting to me. And like I think that comes across in when you listen to music. If someone's really interested in something, like I think it's like it's apparent in the music. And I started, like, I was using my performance recitals more as a vehicle for, like, arrangements and, like, yeah, for musical experiments almost. And at this point, like, I kind of went, I spend most of my time arranging and composing. Why am I doing a performance degree? So then I started doing a composition degree. At the same time, I was still kind of playing in bands and experimenting with like production-y stuff. So I played in a hip-hop band called Beneath Bonetta, and then formed the band that I'm in at the moment, Helena Pop, who was sort of a folky kind of band, pop music band. I released like a solo record at around this time, and of like electronic music, and I was working with like real life performers when possible, doing like kind of open scored stuff, or like sometimes quite prescriptive stuff, depending on like the kind of performers I had access to. And I guess all of this kind of came together, and at the same time I was thinking very much about like contexts where music is presented, and like performance venues, and like social interactions that and communities that form around music, and the way that these things kind of create feedback loops between like a music performance and an audience, and like how these two things inform each other, like down to insignificant details, like the way the chairs are arranged in a room, or like, and I like looking at all that stuff, and how like whether or not you conform to what's expected gives the audience certain pieces of information. So like if all the chairs are arranged like in rows facing towards a stage, then the audience has this like perception that like you will sit down and there's this invisible wall between you and the performers. Whereas if you put all the chairs in a circle and surround the audience, then they have a different like way of viewing the sound, and they might be more open to experiencing it in a different way. And that's sort of when I started doing these like more installation-based things. So I was involved in the festival You Are Here, which was really great. I think the first time I like actively like put on a work for them was in 2016 with the piece Pieces for Cars, Tunnels and Hexagonal Vents, which is a site-specific work that's very hard to explain, but essentially there's this courtyard. I don't know if it still exists, but there's this courtyard in Canberra where there are these hexagonal vents with a tunnel underneath them. And what we did was we put 4 cars underneath a vent each, and then just had their stereos turned up and played like a CD. Each car had its own CD of music composed by some local composers, including yourself, Ben. And I think we used your car, which forever grateful. Yeah, so there was that, and like finding other kind of interesting acoustic spaces, like the Sky Space at the National Gallery was a really important one for me. And doing like these kind of very intimate works, like I did one which was entirely through a stethoscope, so kind of changing the audience relationship to be like only through this very tactile thing. And just like very much trying to find a different way to present music. And like when I kind of after I finished my degree and was kind of looking back at all the stuff I had done, I came to this like kind of realization that the reason that I was doing all this stuff was because I was like dissatisfied with like the performance spaces that existed, and like the models of social interaction within those spaces felt like they were based on some like very old ideals that I didn't like necessarily agree with. So in I guess the following 2 years I kind of made that my focus. So rather than just making like art that I felt was interesting in these spaces, I wanted to kind of create spaces where the like dominant narratives of social interaction were different. I produced this work called Blankets, where there were 6 kind of fabric tents hung from the ceiling in a theater space. And inside each tent there was a wooden like kind of scale that sent a message to my computer that turned the audio on for certain parts of a song. So the idea for that was to really kind of deconstruct how a performance is organized and where the like where the people are and who has like I guess access to the like to you as an audience member. So like in like kind of bar settings, like where you would play gigs as like a rock band, there's a lot of kind of like expectations on your behavior and like I guess the way that you look and the way that you're perceived by other people. And I wanted to create a space where like you had the option to be perceived or not, so you could go into like these tents and kind of you're no longer being perceived, but you're still contributing to an experience. And like you're doing that very actively because you're actually making part of the song or the piece of music happen through your participation. And I guess that was also partially inspired by like trying to replicate like models seen in like religious community building. So like the idea of being like present with people, but without the expectation of being like actively social. That was a really interesting thing to me. So yeah, it kind of became this thing about like communities and the way that we like interact within them. It's very hard to write site-specific works when you're in lockdown for 6 months. So I've been looking more into like things like physical modeling synthesis and like machine learning, as well as like making music myself. So like going back to the kind of like production side of things I was doing earlier in Canberra. Every like kind of musician, when they go into a tertiary institution, has to kind of confront this idea that we don't really know what music is, right? Like, and you create either like a very small or a very narrow definition of music depending on like, I guess, who you are and what you value. And like, I guess there were certain things that like I was interested in challenging like throughout my degree, like the kind of formal composition settings. I was very interested in doing things like so the first piece I ever wrote as part of my undergrad was a piece for music stands. So like performers had instructions to do certain things to their music stands over the course of like a 4-minute time span, which like is kind of silly and fun, which I like a lot. But also like it's this kind of like critique or like questioning of why we put certain music on like a pedestal, and the music stand is part of that, like part of constructing that, right? Like having a music stand implies certain things, and it like changing that kind of relationship between the music stand as a passive object to be a sound producing object. But like I guess where I'm going with this is that music quite often happens like in the mind of a person, or I guess animal, or probably in the future machine, where like that it becomes music because it's being perceived that way. And that's kind of, I guess, why like anyone can be a composer, because if you like, I think listening to the sounds of nature in a certain way is an act of composition, right? Like if you were to go outside and like sit down and put a frame around the sounds around you, which is your like way of listening to them, like that's an act of composition. I think that's kind of the perspective of coming at composition that I've taken and that I want to take. But there is this kind of idea that a composer is someone who like knows more than you, or like has this expertise in like putting sounds together to create like masterworks or something, which is not really a narrative that I like to buy into.
Let's talk about your composition work. You've talked about the site-specific nature of the work, but like I said, like your work, it can vary so drastically. even like you said, when you're talking about specific settings for the music. Like I know when you've written pieces for string ensemble, it takes on this form of like maybe following the kind of modernist or the minimalist aesthetic, like you're kind of following on that Glassian kind of aesthetic. But then if you're doing site-specific work, your aesthetic changes so drastically, especially for maybe even that piece like Blankets, because you're allowing the audience to kind of build the composition or what they're hearing and how they're perceiving it. You're kind of forced to take on these different aesthetic directions or roles. But how do you see your work in the kind of lineage of music, I guess?
Yeah, I guess like a lot of the time as a student, you try out like a bunch of different stuff. So like the kind of Glassian, like minimalist stuff that I was doing was like something I wanted to explore, but it's not really an aesthetic that I identify with anymore. I guess like one of the things I think about a lot in terms of music is the idea of like perceptual thresholds. So like whether something is like rhythmic or arrhythmic depends on like the kind of time frame that you're looking at it in, or like whether something is tonal or noise. Like there's like the space between a sine wave and noise is pretty massive. Like the amount of different things that like are combinations of those two. And like the point where it becomes something that like repeats or something that is like noise, for lack of a better term, like is different for everybody. And that's kind of the thing that I like to exploit a lot. So in trying like in that in the piece, like the string ensemble piece that you're talking about, Sentiment, there's like this idea where there's a very steady thing, like that's the string ostinato, and then kind of chords that using like very slow glissandi kind of pull away from and together. So there's this like liminal space in between the harmony where something's moving, which I found really interesting. And the kind of repetitive nature of that riff was meant to be an anchor around which you could like experience this morphing texture. And I think that's kind of the same, like there's a similar like motivation to doing that to what I was doing in Blankets. In the Blankets, the material for it was very much like exploring the space in between like strict metronomic beats. So I was kind of, if you imagine a 3-beat phrase, like the second beat usually falls in the middle, but it could move like to the left or to the right, like depending on the way that you're thinking about it. So setting up these kind of repetitive larger structures with like gaps in between where there's like, when does this become something different, and like using very slow change to exploit that. So I guess that's kind of like aesthetically what I'm interested in, is like different kind of like thresholds where something becomes something else to a different person. And I use like the space or the context. More recently, I've used it more as like something to inform like other elements of the piece. So like writing for string ensemble, I didn't do anything too drastic because like I mean, you know the people in the ensemble and like what they'll be sort of willing to do and willing to like engage with and excited to do. So like I quite often like performances where like the ensemble leaves. But I probably wouldn't do that with like a full orchestra, you know. Yeah. So like there's these kind of like you can when you're dealing with like the kind of meta element of structure and you don't have like control over the way your thing is being presented, you do sort of have to like concede like to that. And like kind of play within that that kind of narrative or that like situation, but like I like finding little ways that I can like kind of bring up these questions if I am working within one of those contexts.
The album that you released is very like is kind of it's very in the box, but it also kind of takes all these sounds that you kind of have picked up along the way from outside the box, things like samples of like rehearsals and that kind of stuff like that. But how do you see that? Because I know that like your interest and aesthetic has changed since putting that that body of work together, and now you're kind of moving in a different direction for your solo kind of in the box producer work.
Yeah, so I guess like one of the things that's kind of changed about the world that like possibly has facilitated the change in aesthetic that I'm going through at the moment is that like sound files were really important to me in that period, like up until about 2016. But then like Spotify came along and like I no longer have sound, like I have sound files that I produce because like I've made them, or like stuff that I've downloaded because I was really excited about. But like I no longer have like a really well curated like iTunes library or something like that, or like, and I'm not like producing a lot of like recordings of rehearsals to listen back to. And even like field recordings I will only make now if I feel something is like really interesting to me. But at that point in time when I was putting that together, like sound files were a really interesting thing. Like, and I guess this also comes back to context in a lot of ways, like changing the context of a sample, like to put it, changing it from being a rehearsal recording, which is like a tool to make you better at playing your instrument, into like something that actually has aesthetic value. Like the fact that it was made, like that this sound, like this series of dots that make up a waveform was made like in this place with these people, like that has something interesting about it. That like could be, and in fact is like interesting in of itself, not just as a tool to creating something else. And like I was also very invested, and I still am to a degree, in like I guess paying homage or like acknowledging all of the stuff that's gone into like that I've listened to and loved and absorbed, that like is kind of, I guess, being processed by me and being put out back as like as some form of output. So like sampling was a really integral part to like, for me at least, to honor like the stuff that I was really invested in and like listening to heaps of. that was why that album kind of turned out the way it did. And like there's still things that I really like about the album, but in the kind of like in as like I've progressed further, like sound files kind of have dropped away because I'm not doing many rehearsals where I need to record things, like because I'm writing music more often than like practicing for a performance. And like in doing that, I kind of also became more interested in the sort of sounds that I can produce like in a room. And partially that's because I have a microphone now and I didn't at the time. Like all the guitars were direct in on that record, and all the features, like people just recorded themselves, and then I had to like, and this was before like RX and you could like do crazy noise reduction stuff, or at least before I knew about that stuff. So like just fitting them all together was kind of this fun challenge of like, here's something recorded on someone's phone and here's something recorded like on a laptop microphone, and here's something recorded like in a home studio, and like how do you make them all kind of fit together? Yeah, so like having a microphone and also like not wanting to, like, sampling is technically illegal which is not, I mean, if we go into my thoughts about this, it will take all day. But wanting to make music that I could put out like onto more platforms like Spotify was another like kind of motivator for wanting to get better at recording sounds and like making sounds myself. So there's this kind of, I guess, like the stuff that will come out in the future has this kind of folkier aesthetic. And that's also like, to a degree, like a change in my listening habits. Like I was listening to a lot of sample-based music at the time, and I still do, but I also started listening to people like Bright Eyes and Phoebe Bridgers, and like getting very invested in those sorts of sounds. And like Bright Eyes in particular do a lot of work with like sounds that aren't necessarily made to be musical. Like they do a lot of stuff with field recordings and like atmospheric sounds that was really interesting to me in the context of like an emo folk record. And I guess that was kind of what motivated the change in aesthetic. But I think they'll probably, like, you know, the next one that for some reason I'm planning, despite having not finished the current one, will again be another like change in aesthetic towards more electronic music. And I guess to a degree there's not really like there's not really a grand plan for this. Like it's, as much as I plan things out and like I'm interested in doing certain things for reasons, it's more like I have this intuitive feeling that I should do this and that will be like interesting. And then in a certain sense you can kind of analyze it later.
Because the computer and Ableton is this kind of otherworldly instrument that we tap into, sometimes do we know what sound we're going to create, or are we using this tool and then kind of exploring, and then we'll land on a sound and we'll be like, okay, yeah, that's the one that sticks in the production.
Yeah, I guess there's a degree to which both approaches are valuable, right? Like, if I'm mixing something, like, I'll always have reference tracks, because I want things to sound a certain way. But if I'm more in like a creative mode where I'm like, what can we do with this like raw material? Then maybe like the more experimental approach, like opening up something and like being like, what can this do for this song? But I guess with like production, a lot of the time what I think about, if it's someone else's song particularly, like is like what am I being told by the raw material that exists, and how do I enhance that? And that can be like a very like a process where I'm like, I know how this should come out, or how to enhance these things. Is like, I'll just open up this Mellotron patch and like, you know, that kind of stuff. But like, I also do like, the stuff that I'm doing at the moment is very deliberately trying to find stuff that I couldn't come up with. So this is like, the stuff that I'm doing with like machine learning is very much about finding things that I would never think of. So like finding patterns that humans don't necessarily perceive but machines can is really interesting to me, and exploring these kind of like hidden layers of process. So like the way kind of like this model called sample RNN works is essentially it creates a big block of noise and then like pulls away bits of that noise until it sounds closer to like something that it recognizes as like a thing that you've told it is. So like you can be like, here's a bunch of stuff and I want you to make something that is like this stuff out of this block of noise, and it will like create it will create layers and layers of just chipping bits away to be more like this thing. And all those kind of interstitial layers are really interesting because you hear this kind of like birthing process. You hear like the logic of the machine as it kind of like tries to figure out what's going on. And it's different from like human logic, if I can be as like grandiose as to sum up what human logic is, but like it feels very different. And like I will very intentionally seek out things that are from perspectives that aren't my own, because I think that's how we make music more interesting in general. I listen to a lot of what we can crudely term outsider music, which is like just music that there's not really a good definition for it yet. I'm working on it. But like music that's kind of pop adjacent, but made in such a way that it feels very strange and alien. Like a lot of that stuff is super interesting because it's not the way that you would produce like sound from like a conventional like in the box studio approach, but it has this like quality that's very different and very like engaging. And like, yeah, hearing different people's perspectives is always like at the heart of like creating music, right? Because we're trying to understand people from different perspectives and like understand subjective experience, which I think is a lot of why why we do make music is like to share what's going on inside our heads. You know how like there's conversations that you just keep having because like it's the thing that's stuck in your brain. I guess the kind of framing for this is like so I'm in Melbourne and I've been in lockdown for like 6 months now. And I spend a lot of time like on my phone and engaging with content in that way. And like if you think about like so what one of like the things that AI does in terms of like your interactions with your phone is like recommendation systems. So stuff like what shows up on your Facebook feed, or like what YouTube videos are recommended to you, or like what ads are shown to you, are all part of this kind of like machine mind that is like trying to figure you out and recommend things to you. And they're getting very good at it. And what's interesting to me about that is that like a lot of friendships that I have are kind of like this idea of sharing music is really important in those friendships. It's like, hey, have you checked this out? No, that's really exciting. Like, wow, that's really cool. But being like isolated for so long and interacting with my phone in the way that I did, like it felt like there was this kind of gap that was forming where like I was being like looking very carefully at what was being recommended to me by Spotify, and like trying to subvert it and like looking at how all of this stuff works, like how the technology around us kind of shapes us. Because like most phones have like a dedicated machine learning chip in them that is trained by your interactions with your phone, and that data goes back to the companies that make the phones. And like there's this kind of feedback loop that you get stuck into where your phone kind of changes who you are as a person, and then that changes the way that the technology is made and the way that it interacts with you. And I was kind of like, I guess a little worried or like even just interested in like the way that like machine learning algorithms can actually replace like social interactions, and the way that works, and kind of the bigger like guiding philosophy around that is like I was looking at a lot of Holly Herndon's interviews, and Holly Herndon has worked a lot with machine learning, like her album Proto, with Spawn, which is an artificial intelligence that she made with Matt Dryhurst and someone else. But yeah, so looking at like the way that she interacts with AI is very particular, because she's interested in like the ways that the quote that I often bring up is like, she says something like, we're not trying to, what is it? It's like, we're trying to use AI to be more human together. And I think that's really like important to the way that I've started to think about AI, and the way that we like interact with it, because AI is very young and like people are doing amazing things with it. But like, I guess another piece of context is that like we think of machine learning as like a neutral actor, often, which it's not. Like it's programmed by people, and what you put into a machine learning algorithm is like determined by like what people want it to do. And like some of the applications for machine learning are like genuinely quite scary. Like I was reading about one that was like training on like dogfight simulators and like could defeat like the best soldiers or something at like in aerial combat. So like obviously that's like training for unmanned drone strikes and stuff like that. And I guess there's this like idea of what do we actually want AI to do? Like what functions do we think it should fulfill, and how do we use it? Like how do we use it for the benefit of like people as opposed to like the benefit of tech companies? Which is why I think like getting involved with the technology is really important, and like artists figuring out the ways in which it works is, and like being able to communicate the way that a machine is thinking to an audience is like a vital role that I think a musician or an artist can have. So I kind of became obsessed with the question of like machine hearing. Like what is a machine doing when it analyzes audio data? Like, and what does it hear? Like if we were a machine, like what would the perception of audio be for us? Which I think comes back to this idea of like music starts to exist in the mind of a person or like an animal. So like if you have something that's trained to look for certain patterns in like audio data, like what is like the process that happens there? Jennifer Walsh has this great album which is made from like the hidden layers of sample RNN, which like kind of shows you how like these voices emerge from like noise, like, and how they kind of evolve, and how almost how young AI still feels to us, like and you can kind of, you get much more of a sense of that, of what's actually going on from the musical examples, and from like, I guess from the stuff that tech companies don't want you to see, right? Like AI has a very like glossy veneer, particularly in regard to like what music is put out. So a lot of it is like, up until very recently, was like protocol data was being analyzed. So MIDI or like OSC was being like funneled through like an AI and then putting something out. So that's how they did like making new Beatles songs, or like Mozart or Bach or something. But this like, that requires someone to realize it. Like it's not creating raw audio. So it's not creating sound. The sound is being made by people still. But then like wavenets were kind of this thing that were invented. I don't know if I'm explaining this well. Wavenets like basically allowed us to work with raw audio, and I think they were developed in 2016. And that's like, that kind of allows like AI to actually work with sound in a way. Like it's still a representation of sound, in terms of like it's a binary file with like yeah, so like there's no, yeah, but like there's such a thing as like non-audio music, right? So like there, like people read scores and hear the music in their head, right? And there are people who do that recreationally even. Or like if I say, like there's dance music playing, like you can picture that in your head, like you can hear it. And like that's, I think, still a musical experience. So I think music can happen without like sound waves happening. And like I wrote a piece like this that was like descriptions of sounds on like cards, and you drew cards out of the deck, and then it would like be a piece that you would play in your head, by imagining those sounds. So I guess like to a degree, like the hearing process is happening in a way, like, and the machine learning algorithms are looking for patterns in that, which is like, at what point it becomes hearing, we don't really know, but like, examining what that kind of hearing is interesting to me, and how it differs from like human hearing. Like what patterns can a machine find that a human wouldn't?
Yeah, and they're not as formal as, we've been taught as trained musicians or anything like that, or even as just like kind of cultural entities within our little frame of, we're Westerners and we listen to Western classical music, whereas the computer might be able to pick up on things outside of structural harmony and that kind of thing, instead of us just being like, okay, well, this is a 2-5-1 and this all makes sense contextually in our harmonic structures and that.
Yeah, I think that's like, I sometimes internally go on this little diatribe about like the fact that Western music theory is often taught in relation to the harmonic series, and it doesn't really make sense. Like the ideas of what's dissonant and consonant being based on the harmonic series is kind of like, it works to a certain point, but if you actually start looking at like music made entirely with sine waves, like it doesn't. Yeah, well, even like if you try and make the sound of a guitar with only sine waves, you're gonna have a really bad time. And that's because like strings have like inharmonic frequencies that sound when you play them, and that's like an interesting thing that people like. And if you just built the harmonic series in like kind of the way that it sounds off a guitar, like you would have a bad well, not a bad sound, but you wouldn't have the sound of a guitar. And I just like, I wonder about, look, this would require a lot of study that I don't think has been done, but like the fact that people teach the harmonic series like it's physical law, which to a degree it is, like resonance does happen at like multiples of the same frequency. Like that's true. But like from a musical perspective, like there's noise and like there's like stuff that's to a degree random, which we really like to the point where most sounds start with a bit of noise. Like playing your guitar, you hear a little bit of noise and then it kind of settles, that noise settles into the vibrations of that string as like a repeated pattern. Like percussion sounds, you hear like noise at the beginning and then it settles down. Yeah. And that's like this kind of like, I don't know if the harmonic series really explains what's like consonant and dissonant in a very like good way. I think it's probably the best way we have to explain it, but I'm not sure that it like, it's not quite as scientific as like we like to think it is. free improv is like fun. That's a good thing about it. I guess like it's a space where you can like explore co-concurrently with other people and like respond to them in like kind of an interesting way. And there's like these kinds of rules of interaction where like depending on circumstance you have like more or less freedom to do things like in a performance or even like a kind of jam setting. I guess something you could maybe compare it to is like if you had like the kind of jam sessions I would have before I started doing free improv were very much in like rock settings or jazz settings where like you would like try and stick to some very specific like parameters. So like in jazz, like particularly in a kind of institutional setting, like you're trying to communicate to people like essentially you're being like, I know the changes to this song and I know how to solo. So book me for all your gigs. And in like, I guess a rock setting, there's sort of like, or a pop setting, there's kind of more freedom, but also kind of less freedom. Like you kind of have this opportunity to like, to play more with textural stuff or timbre. But I guess the harmonic possibilities are sort of limited. But coming to like a free improv setting, I guess felt very like freeing when I started to do it. Because the kind of like a lot of the conventional rules, and there are still like in what we call free improv, there are still rules. They're just like kind of unspoken. But like, yeah, finding that kind of space where you could like explore something that could be like very small. Like, I remember with the experimental music studio at ANU, we played this piece called Boundary Music. I'll just look up who that's by. But essentially the instructions of playing this piece are to make the smallest sound you possibly can to a boundary condition. So like, this is like the quietest sound that I will make, and I will just like be as close to that as possible. So I remember just like probably 6 of us in a room, just like all really slowly moving an object, and like making just the smallest amount of sound, but everyone was so focused on doing that. And so like engaged with these tiny, tiny sounds and the way that they were interacting. And I remember just like finding that really beautiful, seeing like hearing that and like being so engaged with something so small that's usually like quite forgotten about, or like, you know, put aside. And that piece is by Miko Shiomi. And I guess it leads to this like thing where you can combine sounds in different ways, and like I guess the limits of what you kind of consider music or like have listened to or focused on as music can be kind of pulled and pushed by other people doing things, and that can kind of push you to do things that you might not have done otherwise. which I think is a really interesting way of making music and like interacting with other people and learning about them. I did this workshop thing where like we were essentially like put in like it was essentially a free improv like music summer camp basically. So for like 2 weeks we were just in Tasmania doing like weird music stuff. And at this time, I guess I was like, I hadn't played very much music for a while. Like I was seeing myself very in the box as like a composer and someone who produced music in that way. And I remember just like, because there were people from all sorts of different backgrounds, like people with more of a jazz perspective and some people with more classical, and like people at different stages in their like undergrad or postgrad degrees, or just artists like working in the world. And like the way that I like started to perceive myself in that workshop was I felt more like a lighting designer. Like so like this is how I described myself when I was talking to someone, like which I guess like in doing that I learned a lot about myself. But like more than being someone who was like putting forward like ideas and strong things that people could latch onto, I was very interested in doing something very subtle that would change the way that those ideas are framed and positioned. So like the instrument that I had with me was an acoustic electric bass, so like an acoustic guitar but the bass version. And I had that, and I would do things like just letting it feed back or like, but very quietly letting it feed back, or like using an ebow and just creating like a drone underneath what was going on, which I felt like were very like frame centric ideas. Like this is putting this in, like this is a way of seeing this. And I guess that kind of is how that links to my other practices, which are very like perception focused. Like, I'm interested in the way that like the environment changes the perception of the music. So like when I'm improvising, I'm like doing this kind of meta-analysis of like what's going on and like how do I make this scene in a different way, or like how do I engage with the perspectives being put forward here.
As a bassist, and in that context of being a composer, you know, that's one of your practices is I'm this composer and I write this music, but you're also a bassist in a band. And normally, kind of conventionally, we kind of see a bassist as being this kind of, like you said, this kind of framer.
Yeah.
Within a band's context. They're kind of this support actor in the band, but I kind of wonder how you kind of see yourself in the band as contributor, writer, and then maybe as a support, or whatever we can term support player as, because you know we're all kind of equal in this band. If you're not there, this part of the music doesn't exist. So
yeah, Helena Pop's a kind of interesting example of this. Like it's not like I'm just there being like I'm not just like playing some sick bass lines, some sick Jocko licks. Um, so I guess I'll just give some like context for the band, and how we sort of formed and what the band, the way it works, and maybe that will help like elucidate my position within that. So I went to a solo show of Jack Livingston's, and I went to a bunch of them back in the day. But at one point, there was like, it was quite a small show. Like mostly like the people who were in that scene at that time were there, like people who played in bands and stuff. And I kind of just decided, and this was partially inspired by a drummer who I know who's now doing like a master's in economics, I think. But I just sat on stage with Jack playing like his songs, and I just sat there on the stage and watched him for whatever reason. And Hayden Fritzlaff, who is the drummer in the band and in Moaning Lisa, and just does a million other fantastic things. I remember having a conversation with Hayden about Neutral Milk Hotel, who I was obsessed with at the time and still am to a degree, where I was like, oh, I just really want to be in a band that sounds like Neutral Milk Hotel. And he was like, oh yeah, me too. And I was like, sick. And Hayden was there on that night, and Hetty, who used to be in the band, was also there. And I remember asking Hetty, like, do you want to form a band with Jack? And then we went over to Jack and we're like, hey, let's form a band. We did, and Hayden was there, and I knew that Hayden had this interest, and we were like, Hayden, drum in a band. And then we had a band. I guess that's the origin story as it played out. And like Jack is a really fantastic songwriter, like, and he writes so many songs. So what would happen in the early days, and still happens now, is Jack will come in with like a song on guitar and like with the words and the melody. So like he'll play that, and then we like kind of contribute our own parts, and sometimes we'll make suggestions to each other. Sometimes, like with our latest single, we'll all swap instruments. Just to kind of like get this, like, I guess, creative way of interpreting what's there. And like sometimes we'll make little changes to what Jack's doing. Like sometimes we'll be like, what if you don't play the guitar part for this bit? Or like a couple of songs we've even been like, what if there's no acoustic guitar in this song? We just have these other elements. And like, yeah, I think what we've tried to do is create a space with Helena Pop, which is similar to like the free improv like setting, where you can just do, like, you can try something, and it might not necessarily work, and like that's okay. Like there's no expectation that you're going to create any like particular kind of sound. Like it's not like I go in there and I'm like, I need to play the lowest note of everyone else. Like sometimes we'll kind of swap in that regard, and I'll be like making very high sounds, or like just kind of textural stuff. And I guess as like the band developed and we started like becoming more comfortable with not having those set roles, and like just kind of thinking more about what frequencies were present like between us, I guess we've all sort of like started moving like away from like thinking of ourselves with like specific roles in the band. So like I'll play bass parts on most songs. Like I'll play some like either a double bass or like an electric or something. But like on the song That's One Strange Love, like the lowest part is the organ that Dan plays, like, and it's like well below where I'm playing as the bassist. And like then there are other songs where like what I've contributed has been more like field recordings and like atmospheric sounds and stuff. Yeah, I guess we all just want like everyone to feel like they can contribute what they have that will make the song like, I guess what it wants to be, or like what we feel like the song should be based on what Jack brings to us. So like, yeah, sometimes that's like quite a difficult process, and sometimes it's very easy.
The colour's unreal, I know that wattle, yellow flushed against tar black's eggshell, head hung low, miles from your car to my home, nothing sticks in my head, not the cadence, the resonance, the latent vibrations, and maybe a handful of words that were said, but I don't think it's worth repeating, man. Just let some things die in the end. Skip the credits, turn to page 5. Didn't have a plan B, this was how I was gonna live my life. Everything in the middle, of course, I don't miss staring at a screen, constantly figuring out that I'm worthless.
I would always encourage people to listen to Jennifer Walsh. She's fantastic. She has a great album called, it's called like A Late, I'm gonna look it up because it's a long title. It's called A Late Anthology of Early Music, Volume 1, Ancient to Renaissance, which uses like kind of machine learning to abstractly recreate like the kind of narrative of music history that we have in kind of institutions. And I think it's a really great album. I'm just going to shout out a bunch of Canberra bands. So Paint Store released a record, which is great. There's the Ghost Boy record, which you should check out. Who else has been releasing stuff? Evan Buckley, always bringing the goods. Hetty Blaza, just always fantastic. I've been listening to a lot of Vaporwave. Always like the Chuck Person album. That's like just fantastic. Listen to Daniel Johnston, like for ages, even if you don't like it. That's my main recommendation to anyone.
What you just heard was part of the piece Watching the Stars Go Out by Benjamin Drury. You also heard the track Oh What a Shame by the band Helena Pop. We now go live to Cassette Connection's very own Ben Harb. Ben, what can you tell us?
Yeah, reporting live from the studio.
Yep.
My correspondence says...
You are the correspondent.
No, I'm corresponding to you.
Okay.
And I'm saying that was a great interview.
Yeah.
That was a really in-depth interview. And that was a really, I think, probably an incredibly dense interview regarding some of the topics that we did go through there. And I think that's great. I think Ben's ability to kind of give all of this information out about everything that Ben does, like it varies so much. There's so much variance between all this different work. Like, going from, I guess, when we were in uni, there was a lot of work that was, I think, I mentioned this while we were talking during the interview, a lot of work was very kind of minimalist based, open scoring, that kind of thing. And then going outside of that and then into the world of these installations, I think it's really interesting work, and it has offered a lot of inspiration to me, but it's also just incredible pieces of work. And it's a great way of displaying music, displaying different ideas of like how should music be received.
Yeah, you put that really well.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we just kind of get into the habit of like, oh, it's just recorded music. I go onto my phone, I pull up bloody whatever, and I stream some music. But this is, taking it into a context where you have to actually think about, okay, well, I'm here to be a part of this experience. On top of that, all the machine learning stuff is incredibly interesting. It's stuff that, I've never looked into and I couldn't fathom, really.
Machine learning.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's so complicated, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff about, like, you could, I think Ben mentioned this, is like a lot of the data before that was being analyzed by machine learning algorithms and stuff like that, was like how to make a snappy little new buck tune or something like that. And it's like, hang on, that's cool. It's kind of silly when you can get it to be part of the composition process and not just kind of emulate the data of the written score. I think that's all really interesting. And obviously I am very biased towards the work of Helena Pop because I think they're the best band to come out of Canberra ever. So that's my personal take. And I'm sticking by that. So everyone who's
they can fight you if they disagree.
If whoever wants to hate on me, bring it my way. That's all right. I think most people would agree. But that was a great interview. I want to thank Ben for coming on the show and giving us such a great interview and a great talk. I would like to encourage all of our listeners to please subscribe to the podcast on wherever you get the podcast. Subscribe on YouTube. We also have a YouTube channel where we throw up the podcast if that's your desired location. Follow on Spotify or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Cassette Connection is recorded and produced by Ben Hub and Alex Ferrugia. For more information, head to our website, cassetteconnection.com.
You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Cassette Connection. And if you would like to be featured or just want to get in touch, our email is contact@cassetteconnection.com.